There was a certain stillness on the waters of the Gulf of Oman on Monday morning, the kind of stillness that only precedes a storm. Somewhere between the dusty coastline of Musandam and the Iranian shore, where the Strait of Hormuz narrows to barely 34 kilometers of turquoise tension, two American-guided missile destroyers had already made their statement. The USS Frank E. Peterson and the USS Michael Murphy sliced through those contested waters over the weekend, the first U.S. warships to do so since the war began on February 28th. And just hours later, the entire architecture of global maritime commerce received a new set of rules, written not in Geneva, not at the United Nations, but on a social media platform by the President of the United States. The blockade was on. Effective 10 a.m. Eastern Time, April 13, 2026, the United States Navy began enforcing what Washington called an impartial embargo on all vessels entering or departing Iranian ports. The question that hung over every shipping lane from Shanghai to Rotterdam was deceptively simple. Was this about Iran? Or was this about something much, much larger? To understand what happened at Hormuz, one had to rewind, not just to the weekend's collapsed peace talks in Islamabad and not even to February 28th, when Operation Epic Fury sent American and Israeli warplanes screaming across Iranian skies. One had to go further, back to the very DNA of how the modern world organized its energy, its trade, and its power. The Strait of Hormuz was never just a waterway. It was the jugular vein of the petroleum age, the single geographic choke point through which 20% of the world's oil and a fifth of its liquefied natural gas had flowed for decades. It was the passage that connected the oil fields of Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, and the UAE to the factories of Guangzhou, the refineries of Jamnagar, and the power grids of Tokyo. And in the grammar of geopolitics, from Halford Mackinder's Heartland thesis to Alfred Thayer Mahan's Command of the Sea, whoever controlled Hormuz held a veto over the global economy itself. For generations, that veto had been implicitly American. The U.S. Fifth Fleet, headquartered in Bahrain, had patrolled these waters like a toll booth operator who never charged a fee, but whose mere presence ensured that the fee was paid in dollars through SWIFT, routed through New York clearing banks. The petrodollar system did not require a formal treaty. It required a carrier strike group within striking distance of anyone who dared price a barrel of crude in anything other than the greenback. That was the deal. That was the architecture. And it had held imperfectly with periodic tremors since the Nixon shock of 1971. But here was the thing nobody talked about, and yet it was the detail that decided the entire game. When Iran effectively seized control of the Strait of Hormuz in early March 2026, it did not simply block ships. It began selecting which ships could pass and which currencies they could pay in. Chinese vessels sailed through. Russian-flagged tankers were waved along. Indian ships negotiated access. Pakistan, Malaysia, Thailand, the Philippines each cut bilateral deals with Tehran, and at least 2 toll payments were reportedly made in Chinese yuan, not dollars, yuan, in the middle of the most dangerous maritime crisis since the tanker war of the 1980s. The currency that underwrote the entire post-Bretton Woods order was being quietly bypassed, not in a BRICS summit communique, not in an academic paper, but in the actual operational flow of global energy commerce. This was the backdrop against which the Islamabad talks unfolded and collapsed. Pakistan, in a remarkable diplomatic pivot, had positioned itself as the host and mediator for the most consequential face-to-face negotiations between Washington and Tehran in decades. Vice President J.D. Vance led the American delegation. Iranian negotiators arrived with a list of demands that read like a counter-manifesto to the American century: full control of the Strait of Hormuz, war reparations, a comprehensive regional ceasefire that included Lebanon, and the release of all frozen Iranian assets abroad. Washington's single non-negotiable demand was nuclear, the complete cessation of uranium enrichment and the dismantlement of Iran's major nuclear facilities. 21 hours of talks, marathon sessions, and then nothing. Vance flew home. The ceasefire hung by a thread, and Trump took to social media with capital letters and the grammar of ultimatum. Now we were getting to the most surprising part of this story, because the blockade that Trump announced on Sunday and that CENTCOM activated on Monday morning was not what it initially appeared to be. The first social media post suggested a total closure. No ships in, no ships out, period. But the operational reality, as clarified by Central Command, was more surgical and more revealing. CENTCOM stated that the blockade would be enforced impartially against vessels of all nations entering or departing Iranian ports and coastal areas, including those on the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman. But, and this was crucial, American forces would not impede freedom of navigation for vessels transiting the Strait of Hormuz to and from non-Iranian ports. In other words, the United States was not blockading the strait itself, it was blockading Iran. The distinction mattered enormously because it transformed the move from an act of maritime closure into something closer to a targeted economic siege, a modern-day version of what the British Navy once called a close blockade, designed not to stop the flow of global commerce, but to strangle a single nation's ability to participate in it. The Iranian response was immediate and unambiguous. The armed forces of the Islamic Republic released a statement that carried the weight of a doctrine. If the security of Iran's ports was threatened, no port in the Persian Gulf and the Arabian Sea would be safe. This was not rhetoric, it was strategic symmetry, the logic of mutual vulnerability. Since the war began, the IRGC had launched 21 confirmed attacks on merchant ships, laid sea mines in the strait, and carved out safe routes, requiring ships to contact Revolutionary Guard naval units and pay passage fees exceeding $1 million per vessel. The Iranian military also called the American blockade what many international lawyers were quietly thinking: piracy. Under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, the Strait of Hormuz is an international strait subject to transit passage, a framework that prohibits both coastal states and external powers from suspending free navigation. Neither Iran nor the United States had the legal authority to close the waterway, and yet both, in their own ways, had done exactly that. Iran through mines and military threats, America through destroyers and presidential proclamations. And the detail nobody talked about, but that decided the game, was this. The blockade was not just an Iran story. It was a China story. 80% of Iran's oil exports went to China. Beijing had been paying for that oil in yuan, sidestepping American sanctions through intermediary banks, ship-to-ship transfers, and what Western intelligence called a dark fleet of tankers operating with transponders switched off. When Trump announced that the U.S. Navy would interdict every vessel that had paid a toll to Iran, the crosshairs were not aimed solely at Tehran. They were aimed at the entire parallel financial architecture China had been quietly constructing. China's foreign ministry responded with measured restraint, calling the strait an important international trade route and urging calm. But behind the diplomatic boilerplate lay a harder calculation. China received a third of its crude through Hormuz. Its strategic reserves, roughly 1 billion barrels, provided a cushion of months, not years. Higher energy costs would squeeze margins for steel, chemicals, and electronics at a moment when the economy was already navigating trade friction and repeated growth downgrades. The blockade, in essence, was Washington telling Beijing, your energy lifeline runs through our Navy. The real breaking point started right here, at the intersection of energy, currency, and alliance politics. Because what unfolded in the hours after the blockade announcement was not a unified Western front. It was something closer to the opposite. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer told BBC Radio that the UK would not support the blockade and was not getting dragged into the war. Spain's defense minister called it senseless. Macron announced a joint Franco-British conference on freedom of navigation, framed as a defensive mission, independent of American war aims. Turkey criticized the escalation. Von der Leyen spoke of the paramount importance of reopening the strait without endorsing Washington's methods. Not one major European nation joined the blockade, not one offered naval assets. The NATO allies that Trump had repeatedly berated for strategic freeloading were now actively distancing themselves from the operational expression of American power. The much invoked transatlantic bond, forged in the Second World War and tempered through the Cold War, in the waters of Hormuz. It looked less like an alliance and more like a series of bilateral disagreements held together by inertia. Now, this was where history offered its most uncomfortable echoes. In 1956, when Britain and France joined Israel in attacking Egypt over the Suez Canal, another vital maritime choke point, it was the United States that pulled the plug, using financial pressure to force its allies into a humiliating withdrawal. The Suez Crisis marked the definitive end of European imperial power and the beginning of uncontested American hegemony over global sea lanes. 7 decades later, the roles had not merely reversed, they had fragmented. There was no single hegemon capable of imposing order on the strait. The United States had the Navy, but not the Allies. Iran had the geography, but not the economy. China had the demand, but not the fleet. And Europe had the principles, but not the will. This was the multipolar world, not as a theory, not as a BRICS press conference talking point, but as a lived, operational, chaotic reality playing out in one of the most strategically dense corridors on the planet. Now we were getting to the most surprising part of this story, because the economic ripple effects of the Hormuz crisis had already exceeded every model, every scenario plan, and every war game that the world's defense establishments had run. The head of the International Energy Agency, Fatih Birol, had called this the worst energy shock the world had ever seen, more severe than the oil crises of the 1970s and the disruptions caused by the war in Ukraine combined. And the numbers backed him up. OPEC's March production had plunged by 7.9 million barrels per day, a 27% decline. Brent crude averaged $103 per barrel in March and had briefly touched $128 in early April. With the blockade now in effect, both WTI and Brent had surged past $105, and analysts were openly discussing scenarios of $150 oil if the situation persisted through the second quarter. But the oil price, dramatic as it was, told only part of the story. The deeper crisis, the one that would reshape global politics far beyond the current conflict, was unfolding in the fertilizer markets, in the food supply chains, in the grocery stores of nations that had never heard of Hormuz until their bread prices doubled. The Persian Gulf accounted for roughly 30 to 35% of global urea exports and 20 to 30% of ammonia exports. These were not luxury commodities. These were the chemical foundations of modern agriculture, the inputs without which wheat fields in India, corn farms in Brazil, and rice paddies in Southeast Asia simply could not produce at scale. When Hormuz closed, it was not just oil tankers that stopped moving. It was the fertilizer supply for the next planting season. The Philippines had already declared a national energy emergency in late March, the first country in the world to do so. Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nigeria, Vietnam, and Zimbabwe were all facing severe fuel shortages. And across the Gulf Cooperation Council states, which imported over 70% of their food through Hormuz-linked routes, a grocery supply emergency had forced retailers to airlift staples, triggering price spikes of 40 to 120%. This was the dimension that the cable news chyrons missed. The war was not just about nuclear programs and naval deployments. It was about whether a family in Manila could afford cooking gas, whether a farmer in Uttar Pradesh could source fertilizer for the monsoon crop, whether a bakery in Cairo could price a loaf of bread that its customers could still pay for. The Strait of Hormuz, in its closure, had revealed what the globalized economy had been designed to conceal: the terrifying fragility of a system in which 20% of the world's energy and 30% of its fertilizer transited a single 34-kilometer bottleneck, guarded by no one and vulnerable to everyone. And the detail nobody talked about: but that decided the game was the timeline of exhaustion. According to JP Morgan analysts, the last two oil tankers that had loaded cargo from Gulf ports before the war began were still on the water. One, the Ocean Thunder, was scheduled to deliver Iraqi crude to Malaysia. The other, the Yuan-Juan, was carrying jet fuel bound for Australia. Once those two ships reached their destinations, the world would have exhausted its supply of pre-war crude and fuel. 250 million barrels of stored crude had already been drawn down globally since the conflict began. The strategic petroleum reserves that nations like China, Japan, and India maintained were buffers, not solutions, measured in months, not years. Every day the strait remained effectively closed, the buffer shrank. Meanwhile, at the United Nations, the geopolitical architecture of the crisis had been laid bare in a single vote. On April 7th, Russia and China vetoed a Security Council resolution proposed by Bahrain and backed by 11 members, calling for Hormuz to be reopened. The original draft invoked Chapter 7, authorizing force. It was watered down to defensive measures only. Watered down again to remove Security Council authorization entirely. And still, Moscow and Beijing said no. China's envoy argued that such a resolution, while one side was threatening the survival of a civilization, would send exactly the wrong message. The veto drew a line through the council that mirrored the line through Hormuz, separating those who saw the crisis as Iran's provocation from those who saw it as America's war. For Beijing and Moscow, the root cause was the war itself. Remove the war, remove the crisis. Everything else was symptom management by the party that had caused the disease. The real breaking point started right here, in the divergence between two incompatible narratives. In the American version, Iran was an extortionist that had mined international waters and was levying tolls on the global economy to fund nuclear ambitions. The blockade was a corrective measure. In the Iranian narrative, shared by China, Russia, and much of the global South, the United States had launched an unprovoked war, removed Iran's supreme leader from the scene, and was now using naval supremacy to complete the economic strangulation that the bombs had started. Both narratives contained elements of truth, and that was precisely what made the situation so dangerous. Iran's armed forces were on maximum combat alert. The IRGC had vowed a severe response to any military vessel approaching the strait. Trump had threatened to eliminate Iranian fast attack boats using what he described as the same system used against drug dealers at sea. 20,000 Indian seafarers were stranded on vessels running short of food and water. Somewhere in the mined waters between Bandar Abbas and Musandam, the margin between a blockade and a battle was measured in nautical miles and minutes. Now we were getting to the most surprising part of this story. Because underneath the naval confrontation, a quieter revolution was taking place, one that would outlast the war itself. The Hormuz crisis had become the greatest stress test in history for the de-dollarization project, not as an abstract BRICS summit concept, but as an operational necessity. When Iran charged passage fees in yuan, it was not making a political statement. It was conducting commerce in the only currency available, because the dollar system had been turned into a weapon. When Tehran floated the idea of accepting tolls in rials, it was probing whether a sovereign currency could function in the most critical trade corridor on Earth. The parallel financial architecture that China, Russia, and Iran had been constructing, CPS, bilateral swap lines, digital UN pilots, had been theoretical chess pieces until February 28th. The war turned them into necessities. The blockade accelerated the timeline from years to weeks. Every Chinese vessel that transited Hormuz paying in yuan demonstrated that the dollar's monopoly on energy trade was not a law of nature but a convention. And conventions could be changed. This was the deeper map the blockade had revealed, not naval deployments and carrier strike groups, but systemic transition. On one side, the United States was deploying the full spectrum of its maritime power to enforce an economic order it considered synonymous with global stability. On the other, a coalition of necessity, Iran, China, Russia, with India hedging as always, was demonstrating that alternatives existed, however fragile. The old Silk Road bypassed the maritime powers of its era. The new Silk Road, the Belt and Road Initiative, the International North-South Transport Corridor, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, was designed for exactly this scenario, a world where sea lanes could be closed by a single navy, making alternative routes not a luxury but a strategic imperative. The Kremlin underscored this logic. Spokesman Dmitry Peskov criticized the blockade with dry certainty, noting that such actions would continue to negatively impact international markets. Russia, which had redirected its energy exports eastward since 2022, was watching Hormuz as both a cautionary tale and a vindication of every argument it had made about alternative systems. And the detail nobody talked about, but that decided the game, was the position of the Gulf states themselves. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, nominally American allies, hosts to military bases, pillars of the petrodollar order. But the war had exposed a cruel paradox. The same American military presence that was supposed to protect them had triggered the conflict that now threatened their survival. Iranian missiles had struck infrastructure across the Gulf. The strait that carried their oil and food was closed. Desalination plants, the source of 99% of drinking water in Kuwait and Qatar, were potential targets, and the American response was not to de-escalate but to impose a blockade that further restricted maritime access. So the Gulf states made their own moves. Saudi Arabia restored full capacity through its east-west pipeline to the Red Sea port of Yanbu, bypassing Hormuz entirely. The UAE routed exports through Fujairah. Oman's deep-water ports at Duqm, Salalah, and Sohar, outside the strait, became the most strategically valuable real estate in the region. These were not gestures of alliance solidarity. They were acts of self-preservation. This was the map that Mackinder never drew, because his Heartland theory was about land power, about the Eurasian interior that no maritime empire could reach. But Hormuz was revealing a new proposition, that the maritime choke points themselves were the pivot areas of the 21st century, and control over them was not permanent but contested. Hormuz was not the only choke point under pressure. Bab el-Mandeb had been destabilized by Houthi attacks. The Suez Canal's relevance had diminished as ships rerouted around the Cape of Good Hope. The Malacca Strait remained a perennial Chinese vulnerability. And now Hormuz, the greatest of them all, had been removed from the global commons, split between an Iranian claim and an American counterclaim, with everyone else trapped in between. The economic consequences were cascading through every sector, every continent, every household budget. OPEC's April report had slashed second quarter global oil demand by 500,000 barrels per day, citing transitory economic weakness and the logistical fallout of the conflict. But prices defied the demand forecast because the supply disruption was so massive that even reduced demand could not absorb the shock. Analysts at the International Energy Agency estimated that the disruption had removed close to 20% of global oil supplies from the market, between 2 and 3 times larger than any previous geopolitical oil supply shock in history, including the 1973 Arab embargo and the 1979 Iranian Revolution. The Dallas Federal Reserve published a working paper calculating that a one-quarter cessation of Gulf exports would push WTI to $110 per barrel. A two-quarter cessation would peak at $132. If the blockade persisted, $150 oil was not a worst-case scenario. It was a baseline projection. The ripple effects extended far beyond energy. The European Central Bank postponed rate reductions and cut GDP growth projections. UK inflation was expected to breach 5%. EU manufacturers imposed surcharges of 30%. Aviation was in crisis. United Airlines withdrew its 2026 guidance. Delta projected a $2 billion quarterly cost increase. In Asia, the pain was more existential. Japan imported 90% of its crude through Hormuz. South Korea activated a 100 trillion won stabilization program. India imposed fuel export duties and rushed 600,000 households onto piped gas in March alone. The Philippines remained under energy emergency. Myanmar restricted vehicles to alternate days. The IEA called it the greatest energy security challenge in history, and the damage compounded daily. Insurance premiums climbed, investment decisions were deferred, supply chains rerouted at enormous cost. And yet, amid the chaos, a new architecture was emerging. Not designed, not coordinated, but forced into existence by necessity. Iran's selective reopening of the strait to friendly nations had created a de facto two-tier maritime system, one for countries aligned with Tehran, another for the rest. The yuan-denominated toll payments had established a precedent for non-dollar energy transactions in a conflict zone. Saudi Arabia's pipeline pivot to the Red Sea had demonstrated that Hormuz dependency could be reduced, albeit partially. Oman's ports were being repositioned as strategic alternatives. India was accelerating domestic gas infrastructure. China was drawing on reserves while expanding overland energy imports from Russia and Central Asia. None of these were permanent solutions, but collectively they sketched the outline of a post-Hormuz world, a world in which the assumption that one waterway and one currency and one navy could underwrite global energy security was no longer operative. The question that remained, the question that hovered over every chancellery, every trading floor, every cabinet meeting from Washington to Beijing, was whether this moment of fracture would be temporary or permanent. Wars end, blockades are lifted, tankers eventually resume their routes, but the systems that emerge from crisis have a way of persisting long after the crisis itself is resolved. The 1973 oil embargo gave birth to the International Energy Agency, to strategic petroleum reserves, to France's nuclear program, to Japan's efficiency revolution. The 2022 Ukraine conflict accelerated Europe's LNG diversification and Russia's pivot to Asia. What would the 2026 Hormuz crisis produce? A new maritime security architecture for the Gulf, a Chinese-led alternative payment system for energy trade, an Indian infrastructure revolution, a permanent reduction in Gulf choke point dependency, or simply a return to the status quo ante, with the same vulnerabilities, the same assumptions, and the same 34-kilometer bottleneck waiting for the next war to shut it down. The great French geographer Fernand Braudel once wrote that the Mediterranean was not simply a sea, it was a civilization defined by the routes that crossed it. The Strait of Hormuz in our time had become something similar, not merely a waterway, but a civilizational nexus, the point where energy met currency, where military power met economic dependency, where the old unipolar order met the messy, contested, multipolar reality that was replacing it. The blockade of April 13, 2026 was not an endpoint, it was a threshold. And the world that existed on the other side of it, the world of $100 oil and yuan-denominated tolls and carrier groups playing chess with fast attack boats, that world was not coming. It had already arrived. What remained to be seen was who would write its rules, and in whose currency those rules would be denominated. Because if Hormuz had taught anything, it was that the most powerful force in the 21st century was not a missile or a warship or even an algorithm. It was geography, 34 kilometers of water, and the audacity of those who believed they could control it.